I never imagined I'd be a widow at 32, but here I am, sitting at the kitchen table at 7 a.m., trying to get my 6-year-old son, Lucas, ready for school while swallowing back the tears. It's been 8 months since the accident at the construction site took Aaron from us. But some days, it still feels like it just happened. The first few months after his death were a blur paperwork, endless nights of crying, trying to keep it together for Lucas. I don't know how I would have managed without Aaron's parents, Margaret and John. They've been my lifeline, stepping in to help with Lucas, picking him up from school so I can focus on work. Every day after work, I stop by their house to pick him up. And every single time, Margaret tries to hand me money. Really, I can't take this, I told her last week, gently pushing back the envelope she attempted to slip into my purse. Sweetheart, we just want to help, she insisted, her warm eyes locking onto mine. We know the insurance company paid well, but your family. Let us do this. She wasn't wrong about the insurance. After Aaron's death, his company paid out $250,000. Between that and my salary as a marketing manager, Lucas and I were stable. But it was never about money with Margaret and John, it was about love, the kind of unwavering support I wished my own parents showed. Growing up, it was always clear that my older sister, Vanessa, was the golden child. Our parents made sure she had everything: support, encouragement, financial help, while I was the afterthought. That favoritism didn't end when we became adults. It extended to our children. Lucas adores his grandparents, but every visit follows the same script. Last weekend was no different. We walked in, and within 20 minutes, my mother was already sighing in exasperation. "Why does the clock make that sound?" Lucas asked, pointing to their antique grandfather clock. "How does it work inside? Can't you control him?" My mother groaned, rolling her eyes. "He's always asking questions about everything. Vanessa's kids never give us this much trouble." My father barely looked up from his laptop. "Here, Lucas, why don't you play some games? I downloaded a few new ones for you." But Lucas didn't want games. He wanted to talk, to learn, to connect. Meanwhile, Vanessa's 3 kids sat glued to their phones, barely acknowledging anyone's presence, and my parents held them up as examples of how children should behave. I'm used to biting my tongue. I've been doing it my whole life, but it never stops stinging. At least they help occasionally, picking up Lucas when I have late meetings or watching him if both Margaret and John are busy. I try to focus on that instead of the constant comparisons and the feeling that, no matter what, I'll never be enough for them. It was supposed to be a normal Tuesday dinner at my parents' house, but I should have known better. The moment I walked in, I felt that something was off. Mom had made my favorite lasagna, a rare occurrence unless she wanted something. Dad was unusually chatty, asking about work, about Lucas, about everything. They were building up to something. I just didn't know what. "So, Emily," Mom said carefully, slicing her lasagna into neat squares, "we've been meaning to ask you something." I already knew I wasn't going to like what came next. How much was Aaron's life insurance payout? The question hit me like a slap. I nearly choked on my water, completely blindsided. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe I was just sick of keeping secrets, but I answered honestly. $250,000, I said quietly. The room went still. My mother's fork clattered against her plate. My father's head snapped up so fast I thought he might hurt himself. They stared at me as if I'd just announced I'd won the lottery. "Well," Mom said, setting her fork down with a deliberate movement, "what are you planning to do with all that money?" I could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on me. "I invested it," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "It's for Lucas, his education, maybe to help him get a place when he's older." Aaron and I always talked about— "That's years away," Dad interrupted, waving a dismissive hand. "You should be thinking about the present, about yourself, about family." The way he said family made it clear he wasn't talking about Lucas and me. I knew that tone. It was the same one they used when they helped Vanessa with the down payment on her house. The same one when they funded her extravagant wedding. "You could do so much with that money now," Mom chimed in, leaning forward eagerly. "You could help your family. People who need it today, not save it all for some distant future that might never come." I set my fork down. "I'm not discussing my money anymore." My voice was sharper than I intended. Silence fell over the table. Dad's expression darkened, the disappointment clear. Mom pressed her lips into a thin line, the way she always did when things didn't go her way. The rest of dinner passed in tense silence, broken only by the clinking of utensils against plates. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. A week later, my mother called. "We're having a family dinner on Sunday," she announced, her voice warm, as if nothing had happened. "Vanessa and the kids will be there too. You have to come, sweetie." Something about her tone put me on edge, but I agreed. When I arrived, Vanessa was already there, her kids once again immersed in their screens. We sat down to eat, and soon the conversation turned toward money. "Everything is just so expensive now," Vanessa sighed, passing the potatoes. "Bills are piling up. It's hard to make ends meet these days." Mom dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. "Your father and I barely have enough for a normal life anymore." Then Vanessa cleared her throat and sat up a little straighter. "I've been thinking," she announced, her voice carrying the same self-righteous tone I'd heard since we were kids. "Emily and I should help Mom and Dad financially. I'll send them $300 every month. I wish I could do more, but with 3 kids and Ethan being the only one working." She trailed off dramatically before turning to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "But Emily," she continued, "you should send them $1,000 a month." I almost choked on my drink. "Excuse me?" "It makes sense," Vanessa pressed on. "You have a great job. You only have 1 child to support. Plus, with your situation, you have other income now." My stomach turned at the way she skirted around, mentioning Aaron's death directly. I wanted to scream. Wanted to tell them that I was a widow, that I didn't have a second income, that the other income was meant for my son's future. But before I could say a word, Mom clapped her hands together in delight. "Oh, girls! You don't know what this means to us." Dad beamed like it was Christmas morning. I looked around the table, at their expectant faces, and realized the truth. They weren't asking for my help. They were expecting it. And for some reason, I heard myself say it. Fine. The first time I sent them the $1,000, it felt like a punch to the gut. It wasn't the money. I'd been prepared for that. It was the reality of what I was doing paying them to be my family. For years, I'd been trying to make them proud, trying to earn their approval, but it was never enough. And now, this. I had spent my entire life being overlooked, overshadowed by Vanessa, and now I was paying for the privilege of being their daughter. I pushed the thoughts aside. I kept telling myself it was for Lucas, that it was worth it. But the fantasy didn't last long. "Can you pick up Lucas from school today?" I asked Mom over the phone one afternoon. "Sarah has a doctor's appointment, and I have a late meeting." I could hear her hesitation on the other end of the line, the familiar crackle in her voice. "Oh, sweetie, I'm so sorry," she said, her tone thick with the kind of fake sympathy. I knew too well. "I've got a headache. You know how my migraines are." It was always something. Her migraines, her back pain, errands to run, things to do. I began to realize that every time I needed help, there was an excuse, a reason she couldn't be there. Meanwhile, the $1,000 I'd promised them disappeared from my account like clockwork every month. No questions asked. No thanks given. I called Sarah that afternoon, fighting back tears. "Of course we'll pick him up," Sarah said without hesitation. "Jim's already heading to the school. He'll be happy to see Lucas." And so, once again, my in-laws came through for me. Without complaint, without conditions. Lucas always loved spending time with them. They made him feel important, like he was part of something bigger than just us. I looked at the clock as I hung up. It was almost Christmas. I felt a knot twist in my stomach. Christmas had always been a big deal in my family. Growing up, it was the one time of year when we all gathered together. Mom cooked, Dad played the piano, and we exchanged gifts, pretending to be this perfect family. But after Aaron died, things started to change. I had a decision to make. I wasn't sure if I even wanted to go to my parents' house this year, but I had this nagging feeling that if I didn't show up, it would make things worse. So I braced myself. I swallowed my anger, my resentment, and I told Lucas we were going to spend Christmas with my parents. But just days before Christmas Eve, Mom called again. "We've decided to do something a little different this year," she said, the syrupy sweetness in her voice unmistakable. We're having an adults-only party. No kids allowed. I froze, the air thick with disbelief. What? It's Christmas. I know, but we're doing it for a change, she said, brushing it off like it wasn't a big deal. We want to have wine, adult conversation. I cut her off. What about Lucas? There was a pause, and then she casually dismissed him. Oh, you can leave him with Sarah and Jim. I'm sure they'd love to have him. Just like that, my son was uninvited from Christmas. I hung up the phone, staring at it in disbelief. The thought of celebrating without Lucas felt wrong. It felt empty, but I didn't want to cause a scene, so I made a compromise. I would drop Lucas off with Sarah and Jim for a few hours, make an appearance at my parents' house, exchange the obligatory gifts, and then leave. When Christmas Eve finally arrived, I showed up at my parents' house alone. The driveway was packed with cars more than usual for a family gathering. I grabbed the bag of gifts from the passenger seat and made my way to the door, trying to steady my nerves. The sound of laughter and Christmas music spilled into the cold December air. The door opened and I stepped inside, instantly overwhelmed. The room was full. There were relatives I hadn't seen in years. Aunts, uncles, cousins, everyone was there. But what hit me like a punch in the gut was the sight of Rachel's kids, running around with paper crowns on their heads, and my cousin Linda's kids helping themselves to cookies by the tree. More kids appeared in my line of sight. My cousin Mark's twins, my cousin Susan's teenagers. The room felt too hot, too tight. And then it hit me this wasn't an adults-only party. It was a party where only my son wasn't welcome. I stood frozen in the doorway, the bag of gifts hanging limp at my side as the reality of it sank in. Emily, sweetheart. My aunt, Caroline, was the first to spot me. She rushed over and wrapped me in a hug. Then, looking around expectantly, she asked, "Where's little Lucas? Don't tell me he's sick on Christmas Eve." Before I could respond, my cousin Peter chimed in. "Yeah, where's our favorite little scientist?" Jake was looking forward to showing him his new chemistry set. It didn't stop. "Where's Lucas? Why didn't you bring him? What happened to the kid?" I couldn't breathe. I couldn't form the words. All I could do was stand there, staring at the growing sea of confused faces. I scanned the room for my mother, and there she was, in the kitchen, arranging cookies on a platter like everything was perfectly normal, as if nothing had changed. I pushed my way through the crowd, trying to hold myself together. My mind was racing, and my anger was building with every step I took toward her. "Mom," I said, my voice low but controlled. "We need to talk." She turned slowly, setting down the platter of cookies, sensing the tension in the air. I led her away from the prying eyes, out of the noise and chaos of the living room. "You told me this was an adults-only party," I said, my voice steady but sharp. "You specifically told me not to bring Lucas. So why are Rachel's kids here? Why are all the other kids here?" Mom straightened up, adjusting her Christmas sweater, not meeting my gaze. "Well, that's different," she said, dismissively, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "Those children know how to behave. They know how to act at formal gatherings." I stared at her, shocked. "Well-mannered?" I asked, incredulous. "Mom, Lucas is one of the most polite kids I know. His teachers praise his behavior. Sarah and Jim always say how well-behaved he is." Mom interrupted, rolling her eyes. "Sarah and Jim spoil him. They encourage all those endless questions. The other children, they deserve to be here more. They know their place." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I felt a fire building inside me. At that moment, a loud commotion erupted from the dining room. Rachel's youngest son, Kevin, had grabbed a handful of deviled eggs and started throwing them at his sister, causing a mess of splattered egg all over her new Christmas dress. I turned back to my mother, raising an eyebrow. "Well, I can clearly see their superior manners on display." Mom's face hardened. "That's just kids being kids. But when Lucas asks questions about how things work, that's unacceptable behavior." I couldn't hold it in anymore. "You know what? Fine, I'm done." I turned toward the door. "I'm going back to Lucas. He's the only family that matters." "Fine," my mom shrugged, her voice cold. "Leave if you want to make a scene. But put your gifts under the tree first. We're opening them after dinner." Something snapped inside me. Without a second thought, I walked to the center of the living room, clearing my throat loudly. Heads turned. Conversations died. The music stopped. "Several of you have asked why I came alone tonight," I began, my voice stronger than I thought it would be. "Why Lucas isn't here, celebrating Christmas with his family." Rachel moved toward me, but I held up my hand. "Let me finish." I looked around the room, all eyes on me now. "I'm here alone because a week ago, my mother called and told me this was an adults-only party. I was specifically told not to bring Lucas." A chorus of voices erupted. "Wait, all the kids are here," someone said. "We didn't know anything about a ban on children," Uncle Steve added, looking confused. Mom stepped forward, her face flushed. "This isn't the time, Emily." "Oh, I think this is exactly the time," I replied, my voice rising. "You see, there wasn't a ban on children. There was a ban on one child, my son." The room went silent. My son, who apparently isn't good enough for this family's Christmas celebration. The silence in the room was suffocating. I could feel everyone's eyes on me. Some shocked, some confused, others clearly uncomfortable. But I wasn't going to let it go. Not anymore. "I'm done," I said, my voice steady. "I'm done being manipulated. I'm done playing this game." I watched my parents' faces as my words hit them. For the first time, I saw something that wasn't just anger or disappointment. I saw shame. But I wasn't done. "You want money from me? Fine," I said, my blood boiling as I thought about the months of sending them $1,000 without question, without ever getting a thank you or any real help in return. "But you won't see another penny from me after tonight." I looked directly at my mother, whose expression had shifted from disbelief to an icy calm. "I will no longer be sending you money," I continued, "and I won't be maintaining any kind of relationship with either of you or with Rachel." It felt like a weight lifted off my shoulders, but there was still something in the air, something heavy. I turned on my heel and started to walk out. But as I passed the Christmas tree, I saw the gifts sitting there, my gifts. Without thinking, I grabbed the bag I'd left by the door and walked straight out of the house, slamming the door behind me. I didn't look back. The car ride to Sarah and Jim's house felt like an eternity, but in some way, it also felt like it was happening in fast forward. The events of the last hour played on repeat in my mind. I couldn't believe what had just happened. This wasn't the Christmas the first had imagined. It wasn't the family gathering I had expected. I pulled into Sarah and Jim's driveway and immediately saw Lucas through the window, sitting at the kitchen table with a bowl of cookie dough in front of him. He was chatting animatedly, his little face lighting up with joy. He didn't notice me at first, but as soon as he did, his face broke into the biggest smile. "Mom!" he called out, running over to me. "Look, I'm making cookies with Grandma and Grandpa." The sight of him, so happy and so loved, brought tears to my eyes. This is what family should feel like. I dropped the gifts on the table, walked over, and knelt down beside him. "I'm so sorry, buddy," I whispered, holding him tight. "I'm so sorry you had to see that. But we're here now, right?" he asked, looking up at me with those innocent eyes. "Yeah," I smiled, wiping my tears. "We're here now, and we're going to have the best Christmas, okay?" The next few hours passed in a blur of decorating cookies, singing Christmas carols, and watching Lucas light up as he helped Jim arrange the nativity scene. This was how Christmas was supposed to feel, full of warmth, love, and connection. I looked around, taking in the faces of the people who truly cared about us, and for the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. It was a far cry from the cold emptiness I'd just left behind at my parents' house. When the clock struck midnight, Lucas had fallen asleep beside me on the couch, a half-eaten cookie still clutched in his hand. Sarah and Jim were sitting across from me, both quietly sipping their mugs of hot cocoa. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice barely above a whisper. Sarah gave me a warm smile. "You don't have to thank us, Emily. We're family." "I know," I replied, my voice thick with emotion. "But I don't know what I would have done without you guys." The next morning, while Lucas was still asleep surrounded by the presents Santa had brought, my phone rang. It was Aunt Caroline. "You might want to hear how things ended last night," she said, her voice calm but heavy. After I left, it was like a dam had broken. Uncle Mike stood up and said he couldn't stay in the house another minute. Then Aunt Marie and Uncle Steve followed. Soon, everyone was gathering their coats and kids, and the house cleared out in a hurry. "Everyone made it very clear they weren't happy with your parents," Aunt Caroline said, almost in disbelief. Some of them made very loud comments about manipulative behavior and how ashamed they were. They weren't quiet about it. I felt a small, grim smile tug at my lips. "And what about Jack?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "Oh, honey," Aunt Caroline sighed. "He was livid. He packed up the kids right then and there and told Rachel he needed time to think about their marriage. He said he was taking the children to his parents' house for Christmas." Rachel was crying. I sat there processing everything. It felt like the truth had come crashing down all at once. My parents and Rachel had done more damage than I had realized, and the worst part was, they still didn't see it. "I want you to know, Emily," Aunt Caroline continued, "we're all on your side. What they did to you and Lucas is unforgivable." I closed my eyes, trying to hold back the tears. I didn't need anyone to tell me I was right. But hearing those words from someone who wasn't involved, it was like the validation I didn't know I needed. The days between Christmas and New Year's were a blur of quiet evenings, spent at Sarah and Jim's house, playing board games and watching movies. There were no fake smiles, no forced conversations. It was just us family who wanted to be with us, not for what we could give them, but for who we were. I didn't respond to my parents' messages. They flooded my phone, text after text, each one the same: "We're sorry. We were wrong. Please talk to us." But I couldn't bring myself to respond. I couldn't pretend like everything was fine, like their manipulation hadn't cut deep. I deleted the messages, one by one, without reading them again. New Year's Eve morning came and I was dreading the knock at the door. When it came, I didn't even hesitate. I knew exactly who it was. I peeked through the peephole and saw my parents standing on the porch, holding a large, elaborate gift bag. My heart sank. "Emily, we know you're home," Mom's muffled voice called from the other side. "Please, just let us explain." I opened the door but stayed in the doorway, blocking their entrance. They looked smaller somehow, less intimidating than they had just a week ago. "We brought this for Lucas," Dad said, holding the package out to me. The logo of an expensive electronics store was visible through the wrapping. "He doesn't need it," I replied, my voice cold. "Please, Emily," Mom said, her voice cracking. "We're sorry. We've learned our lesson." I looked at them, really looked at them, and all I saw was the same pattern. The same manipulation, the same empty apologies. I shook my head. "I think you should leave." Mom's face crumpled. "But we're family," she protested, tears welling in her eyes. "No," I said, steady and clear. "Family doesn't manipulate. Family doesn't exclude a child from Christmas. Family doesn't lie to get money. What you did, that's not family." They stood there for a moment, silent, and then, with a final look, they left, taking their gift with them. The days that followed felt like a breath of fresh air. For the first time in months, I didn't feel the weight of my parents' expectations pressing down on me. I didn't have to answer their calls or respond to their texts. The silence was both freeing and unsettling. It was the first time I could breathe without feeling guilty for not doing enough or not being who they wanted me to be. After everything that had happened, I expected the fallout to be loud. But it wasn't. It was quiet, painfully so. My phone sat there, buzzing with messages from my parents, from Rachel, from family members trying to pick sides. I read them once, maybe twice, and then deleted them. No longer interested in the drama or the apologies. I knew what I had to do. I moved on. Instead of spending my nights texting, defending myself, or trying to make sense of my parents' manipulative behavior, I poured my energy into Lucas. We spent our time with people who truly cared for us. Sarah and Jim, Aunt Caroline, Uncle Mike, and their families. Lucas started calling Sarah and Jim Grandma and Grandpa instead of Mr. and Miss S. Jones. It felt right. They had become the only family that mattered. One Saturday afternoon, Sarah invited me to go with her and Jim to the farmer's market. It was a small thing, but it meant the world to me. We picked out pumpkins, fresh bread, and local honey. It was the kind of thing that I never realized I needed until I had it, the simple, everyday moments of peace and normalcy. When we got back to their house, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, Lucas and Jim playing in the backyard. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow through the windows. Sarah looked at me, a knowing smile on her face. "You know," she said softly, "I'm proud of you." I laughed. a little surprised. Proud of me? For what? For standing up for yourself, she replied. For protecting Lucas. You've been through so much, but you're doing it. You're showing him how to be strong, how to be kind, how to be yourself, even when it's hard. I stared at her for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. It was hard. It was damn hard. But she was right. I was doing it. I was building a life for Lucas, for myself. And it wasn't perfect, but it was ours. The following week, I finally heard from Aunt Caroline again. It was just after New Year's, and I wasn't sure what to expect, but she had always been there for me, even when my own parents hadn't been. You're not going to believe what happened last night, she said when I answered the phone. I know you don't want to hear from your parents, but I think you need to know. I braced myself, already preparing for something ugly. Your mom and dad tried to save face, Aunt Caroline continued. They've been calling everyone, trying to explain themselves. They even went to Uncle Mike and Aunt Marie, asking them to talk to you. They're saying it was all a misunderstanding, that they never meant to hurt you. I shook my head, almost laughing. They've been telling everyone that they were just trying to help, that they're sorry, Aunt Caroline added. But no one's buying it. Rachel's not buying it. Even some of the relatives that used to side with them are starting to see things clearly. I didn't know how I felt about this. Part of me wanted to feel vindicated, but another part of me didn't care anymore. I had made my peace with my decision. I don't want to get caught in their mess, I told Aunt Caroline, my voice firm. I don't need their apologies. I'm done with them. She was silent for a beat before responding. I get it. You've been through enough. But I just wanted you to know that you're not alone in this. Your family, that's us. And we've got your back. Those words hit me like a wave. I didn't need my parents to validate me anymore. I had found a new family, one that didn't ask anything from me but love and honesty. January came and went, and things finally started to feel like they were settling. Lucas and I were starting to find our rhythm. There were still hard days, of course days when I missed Aaron more than I could put into words, days when the loneliness crept in. But those moments were fewer, and they didn't last as long. I was finding strength in myself that I hadn't known I had. One day, Lucas came home from school and ran straight to me, his eyes wide with excitement. Mom, guess what? He said, almost out of breath. What is it, buddy? I got a gold star today for my science project. Miss S. Phillips said I was the best one in class. I felt a rush of pride. That's amazing, Lucas. You've been working so hard. I'm so proud of you. I hugged him tight, feeling the weight of everything, the loss, the heartache, the struggle melt away for just a moment. This was the life I was building. This was the reason I kept going. A few weeks later, as spring started to peek its head around the corner, I received an unexpected message. It was from Rachel. The first stared at my phone for a while, unsure whether to even open it. Emily, it began. I've been thinking about everything, and I know I messed up. I'm sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to know that I regret how everything went down. I was wrong. I wasn't sure what I was supposed to feel. Part of me wanted to hold on to the anger. Part of me wanted to yell at her for everything she'd put me through. But another part of me felt tired of the fighting, tired of the constant struggle. I put my phone down, deciding to think about it. After a few days, I called Aunt Caroline to talk about it. You don't have to forgive her, Emily, she said, her voice gentle. You can do whatever you feel is right for you, but don't let her manipulate you again. You've built something beautiful with your life, and you don't need to let anyone tear that down. I knew she was right. I didn't need Rachel or anyone else to define my worth. I sent Rachel a short message back. I don't know what to say, but I'm moving forward and I'm doing it for Lucas. That's all that matters. I left it at that. In the months that followed, I continued to build the life I wanted. It wasn't always easy, but with Lucas by my side and Sarah and Jim supporting us, I started to realize something important. I didn't need the approval of people who never truly saw me. I didn't need to chase their love or validation anymore. I had the love I needed, and I was finally okay with that. By the time spring rolled around, things felt lighter. For the first time in months, I woke up every morning without that knot of anxiety in my stomach, the constant hum of dread, wondering when the next call from my parents would come, when the next argument would break out, had quieted. The silence wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was just peaceful. Lucas was thriving. I watched him grow more confident every day, his curiosity blooming in ways I hadn't expected. It was like I could finally see him for the bright, curious little boy he was, without the shadow of everything that had happened looming over us. Every day with him felt like a gift. I spent less time replaying the past in my head. The guilt I'd carried for so long about not being the daughter they wanted, about not living up to their expectations slowly faded. I was learning to let go. Sarah and Jim were still my rocks, but I began to venture out more, carving a new space for myself in the world. I started picking up more freelance work marketing gigs that allowed me the flexibility to be home with Lucas, but also gave me a sense of purpose beyond motherhood. There were moments when I felt like I was finally getting my footing. One afternoon, I sat in the cafe near Lucas's school, my laptop open in front of me, working on a new project. A fresh start. The weight of the past had given way to something new. I checked my phone for the time when an unfamiliar number popped up on the screen. My stomach dropped, but I answered anyway. "Hello?" "Emily," a familiar voice said, and I immediately knew it was Rachel. "I've been thinking about what you said. I know I can't just expect things to go back to the way they were, but I want to make things right. For you, for Lucas, for our family." I paused, unsure of how to respond. It felt like the right thing to do was just tell her I wasn't interested, that I didn't need her apologies or her attempts to fix things. But for some reason, I didn't. Instead, I let the silence hang in the air between us. "I don't know what to say," I finally said. "You can't just come in and fix everything with an apology. I've already made my peace with it, Rachel." "I understand," she said softly. "I just wanted to let you know that I regret how I treated you, and I want to do better." The words felt hollow, but I couldn't blame her for trying. She'd always been the favorite, the one everyone coddled and praised. I wasn't sure if it was too little, too late. Maybe it was, but I had learned enough to know I didn't need to hold on to the anger anymore. "Maybe," I said slowly, "maybe one day we can talk. But right now, I'm not in a place where I'm ready for that. Not yet." She didn't respond immediately, and for a moment, I thought maybe she hadn't heard me. But then she sighed, almost in relief. "I get it. I won't push you. I just want you to know that I'm here when you're ready." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Okay, thanks for saying that." We ended the call with an awkward but genuine silence. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel weighed down by my past. The conversation hadn't solved anything, but it had freed me in a way. I was done with them trying to pull me back into their toxic orbit. It was over, and I was moving forward. The next few months passed in a peaceful blur. Lucas and I made new traditions, nothing big, nothing fancy, just simple moments of connection. We spent weekends hiking in the nearby woods, picking wildflowers or baking cookies in the kitchen while the radio played softly in the background. Life was becoming something beautiful again, something worth cherishing. I also found myself reconnecting with other friends, people I hadn't seen in years. We went out for brunch on weekends, catching up on each other's lives. There was no drama, no pressure, just friendships that had nothing to do with my family's dysfunction. And yet, despite the newfound peace, there was always that lingering thought in the back of my mind. Would they ever truly understand? Would my parents ever grasp the damage they'd done? I couldn't say, but I had come to accept that it didn't matter anymore. The real turning point came one Sunday afternoon when I decided to take Lucas to the local park. The sun was shining, the air crisp, and it felt like the world was finally giving us a break. We walked to the swings, and I pushed him as he soared higher and higher, laughing. For the first time in a long time, I let myself just be. I let go of the anger, the resentment, the hurt that had accumulated over the years. It was gone. When I finally stopped, I sat on the bench beside him, watching him play with a group of kids he'd just met. He was so happy, so carefree. The kind of joy I hadn't seen in him in a while. "Mom," he called out. "Look, I'm making a new friend." I smiled, feeling something in me shift. This was all I needed. My son was thriving, and so was I. It was the small, quiet moments that made life beautiful. The moments that no one could take away from me. Later that evening, after dinner, I pulled out my phone and saw a message from Aunt Caroline. "I hope you're doing okay. I just wanted to say that we're all here for you. Don't let them back in unless you're ready." "I'm proud of you, Emily." I smiled, rereading the message, and felt the familiar warmth of gratitude. She had always been there when I needed her most. I didn't respond right away, just held the phone in my hand for a few moments longer. This wasn't a simple fix. The past didn't just disappear, but I had found something better. I had found peace. And maybe that was enough for now. It was a month later when I saw Sarah and Jim again, and they surprised me by suggesting we take a family trip, just the three of us and Lucas. A weekend getaway in the mountains. Something simple, a chance for us to reconnect, to spend time together without any distractions. The idea filled me with a sense of excitement I hadn't expected. It felt like the next chapter, the one where I stopped looking back and started living. "Let's do it," I said, my voice full of anticipation. "Let's make some memories." The road trip was everything I had needed. It wasn't about escaping, it was about embracing the life I had now. The mountains, the fresh air, the laughter, and the peaceful nights around a campfire. It was the kind of thing I never thought I'd find again. But there it was. We made new memories, small moments that would stay with us forever. The kind of memories that were built on love, trust, and honesty. No manipulation, no expectations, just us. And that was enough. The trip to the mountains marked the start of something new, something that felt solid, something that felt real. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't just surviving, I was living. The mountains brought a clarity I didn't even know I was looking for. Sitting by the campfire one night, watching the flames flicker and dance, I realized how much I'd been holding on to. The past had been heavy, suffocating at times. The need for approval, the years spent trying to prove my worth, the constant battle for validation, it was all so exhausting. And none of it had mattered in the end. I wasn't even sure what made me finally let go of it all. Maybe it was the quiet of the mountains, or the joy in Lucas's laughter as he ran around with Sarah and Jim. Maybe it was just the fact that I had a life now, a real one. I didn't need my parents to define me anymore. I didn't need Rachel's approval or anyone else's. I had my son and I had the family that mattered, and that was enough. When we got back from the trip, the world felt a little different. I felt different. The weight had shifted, and for the first time, I wasn't just the person trying to heal from everything I'd been through. I was the person living through it. I wasn't sure what the future held, but I knew one thing: it was going to be mine. I woke up one morning in late April to find a message from Aunt Caroline waiting on my phone. It was short, but it carried weight. "I'm so proud of you, Emily. You've come so far. Just wanted to remind you of that. You've earned your peace." The words hit me like a wave. I had earned it. I'd fought for it. The journey wasn't over. But I had found something that was worth fighting for: my own happiness. I sat there for a long time, staring at the message, feeling that quiet sense of contentment wash over me. It wasn't the closure I'd been looking for, but it was the kind of peace that could only come from knowing that I had done everything I could for myself and for Lucas. A few days later, I found myself standing in front of the mirror, brushing my hair and thinking about everything that had happened. There was a time when I would have looked at myself and seen someone who wasn't enough, someone who wasn't worth the love and attention I so desperately craved. But now I looked at the woman in the mirror and saw something else. I saw strength. I saw resilience. I saw a mother who had fought to protect her child, who had walked away from toxic people for the sake of her own well-being. I saw someone who had finally accepted that her worth wasn't tied to anyone else's approval. For the first time in a long time, I smiled. The weeks passed and life continued to move forward. The calls from my parents eventually stopped. Rachel sent a few more texts, but I never responded. It wasn't about cutting them off or holding on to bitterness. It was just about knowing my boundaries. I had to protect myself, and that meant I couldn't keep putting myself in situations where I was expected to give, but never received. Lucas started doing well in school, and we were talking about summer plans, maybe a trip to the beach, or just spending more time at the park. We were building a life that was ours, without the weight of expectations hanging over us. Sometimes I'd look at him, at the way his face lit up when he learned something new or told me about his day at school, and I'd wonder how I ever got so lucky. He was my everything. He was the reason I fought through all the darkness, the reason I kept going when I wanted to quit. He was my bright spot. A few months later, Sarah and Jim invited me to dinner. It was just the three of us again, and it had become one of my favorite things, those simple nights where we shared a meal and just talked. It wasn't about anything monumental. It was about the small things that made life beautiful. That night, over dinner, Jim looked at me with a warm smile. "We've been thinking," he said, and I could already tell this was going to be one of those moments. "You should start thinking about what you want for yourself. You've spent so much time focusing on Lucas, and that's been amazing, but it's time you focused on you too." I blinked, surprised by the shift. I had never really thought about it that way. But the more I sat with it, the more I realized he was right. I had spent so much time putting everyone else's needs ahead of my own that I'd forgotten to even think about what I wanted. "What do you mean?" I asked, genuinely curious. Jim leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful. "I mean, what's next for you? You've got this new job. You're building a life for Lucas. But what about you? What makes you happy?" I thought about it for a moment. The question felt strange, but it also felt freeing. I realized then that I was no longer stuck in survival mode. I was living. "I think," I said slowly, "I want to go back to school. I've always wanted to finish my degree. I don't know why I put it off for so long, but I think now's the time." Sarah's eyes lit up. "That's a great idea. You've always been so focused on taking care of everyone else. It's time you took care of yourself too." And just like that, I felt a spark of excitement for the first time in a while. There was more to my story. There were still chapters waiting to be written. It wasn't easy, but I signed up for night classes at a local community college a few weeks later. I felt nervous, unsure, but also excited. It felt like reclaiming a part of me I'd put aside for so long. Lucas was supportive, of course. "Mom, you're going to be so smart. I'm so proud of you," he told me when I told him. I smiled, realizing how much my son had grown, how much we had both changed. The following year, I graduated from college. It wasn't a big ceremony, nothing extravagant, but it was mine. A small victory in a world that had tried to push me down for so long. Lucas was there, his smile wide as he cheered me on. And for the first time in a long time, I could feel the weight of my past lifting. As I walked off the stage, diploma in hand, I realized I wasn't just leaving behind my old life. I was embracing the new one I had built. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I had learned how to stand on my own 2 feet. I had learned that I was enough. A few months later, I got a call from Aunt Caroline. "I heard the news," she said, her voice full of warmth. "I'm so proud of you, Emily. You've come so far. You've built something amazing for yourself and Lucas." "Thank you," I said, feeling the weight of her words settle in my chest. It's been a journey, but I think I finally understand what it means to live for myself. And just like that, I felt like I was finally home. Christmas in our house had always been a spectacle. The perfectly decorated tree, the aroma of holiday food filling the air, and the sound of Nat King Cole playing softly in the background. It was supposed to be a time of warmth and celebration. But that year, I learned that family didn't always mean love. I was sitting on the floor near the tree, carefully placing the last ornament, making sure every detail was perfect. Every year, I put everything together, the decorations, the food, the gifts, the whole holiday experience. And every year I told myself that maybe this time, things would feel different. "Jenny, this is just wonderful," my father, Robert, said, standing by the doorway. He was dressed sharply in a navy Brooks Brothers suit, a sight I rarely saw unless there was a business meeting or a special occasion. "Thanks, Dad," I said with a small smile, already predicting what would happen next. "I wonder if Olivia will be here soon," my mother, Karen, mused, her eyes filled with anticipation. She had spent the last half hour scrolling through Olivia's Instagram feed, gushing over her latest luxury real estate sale. Right on cue, the sound of a luxury SUV pulling into the driveway made my mother nearly sprint to the door. Moments later, Olivia strutted in, draped in designer fashion, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. "Merry Christmas, everyone," she said, flashing a dazzling smile. "Oh, Olivia! What a gorgeous coat!" my mother gasped. "And that bag! Is that a Birkin?" "Of course," Olivia replied, shrugging as if it was nothing. "Oh, and the car outside? It's a 2025 Range Rover. A little gift to myself from my latest deal." My father beamed. My mother nearly swooned. And, as expected, I faded into the background. Dinner passed in a blur of my sister's stories about extravagant parties, high-profile clients, and all the luxuries she had acquired that year. My parents hung on her every word, their pride radiating across the room. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for: the gifts. For Olivia, my mother announced excitedly, pulling out a beautifully wrapped envelope. Inside was a ticket for a luxury cruise, first-class suite, all expenses paid. "You are the pride of our family," my mother said, hugging her tightly. Olivia squealed in delight, immediately pulling out her phone to snap a picture. Then my father turned to me. "And for Jenny," he said, reaching behind him. He handed me a large paper bag. I pulled out the contents: a broom, a dustpan, some used cleaning supplies, and a name tag that read housekeeper. "This should be enough for you," my father chuckled. Olivia let out a mean-spirited giggle. My mother smiled as if nothing was wrong. For a moment, I just stared at the items in my hands. My heart pounded. My face felt hot. But somehow, I managed to keep my voice calm. "Thank you," I said simply. Then, I stood up, placed the cleaning supplies neatly on the table, and walked upstairs. Laughter echoed from the living room as I entered my bedroom and closed the door behind me. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my shaking hands. This wasn't new. It had been this way my entire life. But something inside me had shifted. I walked over to my closet and pulled out a suitcase I had secretly packed weeks ago. Clothes, passport, bank book, everything I needed for a fresh start. I had given them 28 years of my life. 28 years of being the responsible one, the caretaker, the invisible daughter. I left an envelope on my desk with just a simple message: "Thank you for the 28 years." Then I stepped out into the cold December night, the snow crunching beneath my boots. The house that had never felt like home stood behind me, glowing with Christmas lights. A taxi was already waiting. As I sank into the seat and gave the driver my destination, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: relief. For the first time in my life, I was choosing myself, and I wasn't looking back. The taxi ride through the snowy streets of Boston felt surreal. My parents had called me ungrateful my whole life whenever I asked for basic respect, but I wondered what they'd call me now that I was actually gone. Did they even notice yet? Maybe they were still laughing at their own joke, thinking I'd just sulk in my room and get over it like always. I leaned my head against the cold window and watched the city blur past. The Christmas lights twinkled along the streets. Couples walked hand in hand. Kids played in the snow. It was a kind of holiday warmth I had never really experienced. "You okay back there?" the taxi driver asked, eyeing me through the rearview mirror. I nodded. "Yeah, just a long day." He gave me a knowing look but didn't pry. Instead, he turned up the heater slightly, and I appreciated the quiet gesture. 20 minutes later, we pulled up in front of a red brick apartment building in Back Bay. It wasn't a mansion, but it was beautiful in its own way, historic, cozy, and, most importantly, mine. Michael was already waiting on the steps, hands in his coat pockets, his breath visible in the cold air. "You actually did it," he said as I stepped out. "Yeah," I breathed. "I actually did." He grabbed my suitcase before I could protest and led me inside. The apartment was small, but the high ceilings and big windows made it feel open. There wasn't much furniture yet, just a couch, a coffee table, and a tiny Christmas tree in the corner. I dropped my bag and ran my fingers over the kitchen counter, the realization slowly sinking in. No parents breathing down my neck, no passive-aggressive comments, no one calling me selfish for wanting to rest. This was my space. Michael leaned against the doorframe. "How are you feeling?" I exhaled. "Like I can finally breathe." He nodded. "Good, you deserve that." I wasn't used to hearing things like that, deserving things. But instead of arguing, I just let it sit there. That night, I slept with the kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. No guilt, no expectations, just quiet. The peace didn't last long. 3 days later, my phone rang. I knew who it was before I even checked. I let it ring, and then it stopped. A few minutes later, another call. Then another. And then a text. "Mom, where are you? Come home." This isn't funny. I stared at the message, feeling nothing. Then another text. "Dad, we need to talk." And then one that made me pause. "Mom, your father's not feeling well." I frowned. He had always been healthy, if a little forgetful lately. But my mother was known to exaggerate when it suited her. I turned off my phone. By the end of the week, the missed calls were in the dozens. The messages had shifted from anger to panic. Mom, the bills aren't paid. Where's the bank info? Dad, where are my meds? I can't find them. Mom, answer your phone. This is serious. I wasn't surprised. I had been the one keeping everything running. The bills, the food, my dad's medications. I had managed it all, quietly, without thanks. And now, without me, the cracks were showing. I told myself it wasn't my problem anymore. Then, on the 10th day, I got the call that changed everything. A neighbor. Jennifer, it's Mrs. Thomas from next door, she said, her voice tight. Your mother collapsed in the yard. The ambulance took her to Newton Wellesley Hospital. You should know. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Collapsed. I clenched my jaw. Is she? She's stable, but it was close. They said her blood pressure was dangerously high. I closed my eyes. I had been the one managing her diet, making sure she took her meds. Without me, she probably ignored it all. Still, a part of me hesitated. Was this my responsibility anymore? She asked for you, Mrs. Thomas added quietly. That was what did it. I grabbed my coat. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and anxiety. My father was sitting in the waiting room, looking smaller than I remembered. When he saw me, his eyes widened, not with anger, but something else. Relief. Jennifer. His voice cracked. I sat across from him. What happened? He swallowed. She tried to go to the doctor alone. Got dizzy outside. Her blood pressure? He nodded. And other things. They're running more tests. I studied him. The man who had laughed as he handed me cleaning supplies for Christmas now looked like a lost child. His hands were shaking. And then I noticed something else. His eyes were unfocused, like he was trying to place where he was. It hit me all at once. Dad, I said carefully, have you seen a doctor lately? He frowned. I don't need Dad. His face crumpled. And then, in a voice so quiet I barely heard it, they said it might be early-stage dementia. The words landed like a punch to the gut. I exhaled sharply, running a hand through my hair. How long have you known? A while. His gaze dropped. Didn't want to burden you. I almost laughed at the irony. They had never cared about burdening me before. Then something else clicked. Where's Olivia? Silence. I already knew the answer. She was gone. Vanished. And just like that, I realized the full weight of what was happening. My mother in the hospital. My father sick. My sister running from whatever mess she left behind. Everything was falling apart. And I was the only one left standing. I sat in that hospital waiting room for what felt like hours, my mind spinning. My mother was unconscious. My father was forgetting things. And Olivia, of course, was nowhere to be found. I should have walked away. I had spent my whole life being the responsible one, the afterthought, the one they dumped everything on. But here I was, sitting across from my father, watching him rub his temples like he was trying to push away a headache that wouldn't leave. I took a deep breath. Dad, tell me the truth. What's going on? He looked up, his expression tired in a way I had never seen before. Jennifer. The house. The bills. Everything, it's bad. I stared at him. How bad? He hesitated. And then, as if the universe wanted to make sure I got my answer, his phone rang. I watched as he pulled it from his coat pocket, his hands shaking slightly as he answered. Hello? A voice on the other end spoke sharply. My father paled. Yes, I understand, he stammered. We just need a little more time, click. The call ended. He closed his eyes, rubbing his face. That was the bank. I felt my stomach drop. Dad, we're behind, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. On everything. The mortgage, utilities, even the medical bills. I didn't even realize I was holding my breath. And Olivia? I asked slowly. His jaw tightened. She cashed in the cruise ticket and disappeared. Of course she did. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. I shouldn't have been surprised. Olivia had always been like this flashy, reckless, disappearing whenever responsibility got too close. But this was a new low even for her. My father shifted uncomfortably. Jennifer, we need your help. There it was. The thing I had been waiting for. I let out a short, humorless laugh. You mean like how I've been helping for the past 28 years? He flinched but didn't deny it. I should have been furious. Maybe part of me was. But beneath the anger, there was something else. Exhaustion. The kind that settles into your bones and doesn't leave. I sighed. How much do you owe? He hesitated again. I leveled him with a look. Dad, tell me. He swallowed. A little over $80,000 in debt. And, he exhaled, the house might go into foreclosure. I let that sink in. $80,000. Not a couple of missed bills, not a small loan. This was real, irreversible damage. I rubbed my temples. How? At first, he didn't answer. Then finally, he muttered, your mother's medical expenses, Olivia's debts. He looked down, and I wasn't thinking clearly. I blinked. What does that mean? I made some bad investments, he admitted, his voice small. I inhaled sharply, trying to keep my composure. And now you're asking me to fix it. He didn't say anything, but his silence was enough. A nurse appeared at the doorway. Mr. Wilson, your wife is awake. My father pushed himself up quickly, as if eager to escape our conversation. I watched him disappear down the hall, leaving me alone in the waiting room. I sat there for a long time. Then, finally, I stood up, grabbed my coat, and left. I didn't go back to my apartment. Not yet. Instead, I made a stop. Olivia's real estate office. It was a sleek, modern building downtown, all glass walls and expensive furniture. I walked in, my boots clicking against the marble floor, and headed straight to the front desk. The receptionist looked up, smiling politely. Can I help you? I need to speak to Olivia Wilson. The receptionist's smile faltered. I'm sorry, but Olivia no longer works here. I frowned. What? She was let go last week, the woman explained hesitantly. Something about financial discrepancies. I felt my stomach twist. She stole from the company, didn't she? The receptionist paled. I can't say for sure, but you might want to check the news. I didn't need to check. I already knew. Olivia had finally gone too far. And now? Now she was gone. I walked out of the office, my breath coming in short bursts. She had taken everything. She had spent years basking in our parents' love, taking their money, gambling it away, living a life she never earned. And now she had left them to deal with the destruction she caused. The weight of it all hit me at once. I had left them because I was tired of being invisible. But now, when everything was falling apart, when they had lost the daughter they adored, they were suddenly looking at me like I was the only thing keeping them afloat. And maybe I was. I pulled out my phone, staring at my father's last text. I could disappear again, block their numbers, let them figure it out on their own. But could I live with that? I exhaled and typed out a message. Me, I'll be there tomorrow. We need to talk. Then I turned off my phone. Tomorrow I would deal with them. But tonight? Tonight, the first needed a moment to myself. The next morning, I took a deep breath and stepped out into the cold. The air was sharp, biting at my skin as I made my way to my parents' house. Snow had piled up on the sidewalk, untouched. Normally, I would have been the one shoveling it. Their house loomed ahead, looking exactly the same but feeling completely different. The last time I was here, I had left without looking back. Now, I was walking straight into the mess I had tried to escape. When I knocked, there was no hesitation before the door opened. My father stood there, looking older than I remembered. The man who used to be so sure of himself now looked small. He stepped aside without a word, and I walked in. The house was a disaster. Dishes piled in the sink, unopened mail scattered across the table. Dust had settled in places that used to be spotless. The air smelled stale, like no one had cared enough to open a window. My mother was sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket. She looked up at me, her eyes tired, her face pale. You came. I didn't answer. Instead, I took off my coat and sat across from them. We need to be honest about everything, I said, my voice firm. No more pretending. No more ignoring problems until they explode. We're dealing with this now. My father swallowed. Where do we start? I pulled out a notebook from my bag. Let's start with the debt. They told me everything. The house was months away from foreclosure. My mother's medical bills were piling up. My father's memory issues had been getting worse for over a year, but he had ignored it, convinced he could handle things on his own. And Olivia? She had drained their accounts before vanishing, leaving nothing but unpaid credit cards and a reputation ruined beyond repair. I felt my jaw tighten with every detail. "You should have told me sooner," I said finally. My father exhaled shakily. "We didn't want to burden you." I almost laughed. "That's all you ever did." My mother flinched. "Jennifer," I shook my head. "I'm not saying that to be cruel, but we have to face the truth. I was the one keeping everything together. And now, without me, everything fell apart." Silence. Then my father nodded slowly. "You're right. That caught me off guard. He had never admitted that before." I leaned forward. "We have two options. 1. You both figure this out yourselves. 2. I help, but only on my terms." My mother's fingers tightened around the blanket. "What do you mean?" I'm not moving back. I'm not giving up my life for this house. If I step in, we do it my way." They exchanged a look. Then, finally, my father nodded again. "Okay," I exhaled. I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear that. For the next few hours, I sorted through their finances. The situation was worse than I thought, but not impossible. The house could be saved barely. My father's medical care would need adjustments. And my mother, she needed to accept that she couldn't rely on me for everything. By the time I closed my notebook, exhaustion had settled deep in my bones. "We have a plan," I said, standing up. "It's not perfect, but it's a start." My mother looked at me, something unreadable in her expression. "You're different." I met her gaze. I had to be. She nodded slowly. "I see that now." Maybe she did. Maybe she didn't. But for the first time, I didn't care what she thought. I grabbed my coat. "I'll be back next weekend. In the meantime, start selling things you don't need. Cut expenses. Make the calls we talked about." They both nodded. As I reached the door, my father spoke. "Jennifer?" The first turned. His voice was quieter this time. "Thank you." For a second, I didn't know how to respond. Then, I just nodded, and I left. Back in my apartment, I sank onto my couch, letting out a long breath. The weight of the day pressed down on me, but for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like I was suffocating. My phone buzzed. "Michael, how did it go?" I stared at the screen for a moment before replying. "Me? Better than expected. Worse than I hoped." "Michael, sounds about right. Want to grab dinner?" I hesitated. The old me would have said no, too tired, too drained. But I wasn't that person anymore. Me, yeah. "I'd like that." I set my phone down and closed my eyes for a moment. I wasn't done with my family. There was still so much to fix, so many wounds that couldn't heal overnight. But I wasn't alone anymore. And that made all the difference. The following week felt different. Not lighter, there was still too much to deal with, but clearer. Like the storm had finally settled, leaving behind a broken landscape that I could actually start rebuilding. At work, I buried myself in projects, catching up on everything I had neglected while my life imploded. My boss took notice. "Jennifer," he said one afternoon, stopping by my desk, "you've been doing great lately. We're putting together a new project team, and I want you to lead it." I blinked. "Really?" He smiled. "You've more than earned it." For so long, I had poured everything into my family, thinking my work was just something I did on the side. But here was someone who actually saw me not for what I could do for them, but for what I was capable of. "I'd love to," I said. And for the first time in my career, I meant it. By the time the weekend rolled around, I was back at my parents' house. I had given them a week to start fixing things on their own. I wasn't going to swoop in and take over, no matter how tempting it was. When I walked in, I could already see small changes. The house wasn't spotless, but it wasn't the disaster it had been. The stack of unopened bills was smaller. There was a list on the fridge labeled "expenses to cut" in my mother's careful handwriting. She was trying. My father was sitting at the dining table, a chessboard in front of him. When he saw me, he gestured to the empty chair. "Play around?" he asked. I hesitated, then sat down. "You go first." We played in silence for a while. His movements were slower than they used to be, his focus slipping at times. But he was still sharp, still my father. Halfway through the game, he sighed. "I should have listened to you sooner." I studied him. "Why didn't you?" He moved a piece and stared at the board. "Because admitting I needed you meant admitting I had failed." I let that sit between us. Then, finally, I said, "You're not a failure, Dad, but you have to let people help you." He nodded slowly. "I'm trying." It wasn't a perfect answer, but it was enough. After the game, my mother called me into the kitchen. I started looking into assisted care programs, she said, handing me a pamphlet. For your father, just in case. I raised an eyebrow. I thought you wanted to keep things as they were, she sighed. I did. But that's not realistic anymore. Hearing her admit that felt almost as shocking as Olivia's betrayal. I flipped through the pamphlet, scanning the options. This is a good start. She hesitated. Jennifer, do you think I can do this? I met her gaze. You have to. She nodded, and for the first time, I saw something in her eyes I hadn't seen before. Not pride in Olivia, not disappointment in me, determination. The conversation I had been avoiding came 2 days later. I was at my apartment when my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something told me to answer. I pressed the phone to my ear. Hello? A pause. Then a shaky voice. Jenny? I froze. Olivia. My grip on the phone tightened. Where are you? She exhaled. Las Vegas. Rehab. I didn't say anything. I messed up, she admitted. I know that. I stole from my company. I took money from Mom and Dad, and from you. I screwed everything up. I stayed silent, letting her talk. They're making me go through this step where I take responsibility, she continued. And I wanted to call you first. I leaned against the counter, staring at the ceiling. What do you want from me? I don't know, her voice cracked. I needed to say I'm sorry. I swallowed hard. I had waited years to hear those words, but now that they were here, they didn't fix anything. They didn't erase the damage, but they meant something. I don't forgive you, I said honestly. She let out a shaky breath. I get that. I hesitated, then sighed. But if you're serious about changing, prove it. Another pause. Then, quietly, okay. And for the first time in our lives, Olivia didn't try to argue. She just listened. The call with Olivia lingered in my mind for days. I wasn't sure how I felt about it. She had finally admitted the truth. Finally said she was sorry, but words were easy. Olivia was an expert at saying the right thing when it benefited her. Still, there was something different this time. She hadn't made excuses. She hadn't begged for money or tried to spin the situation in her favor. She had simply accepted my response. Maybe she really was changing. Maybe. But I wasn't waiting around to find out. Life didn't magically become easy overnight. My parents still had a mountain of financial issues to deal with, and my father's memory wasn't going to get better. But there was progress. Each weekend, I went back to their house not to fix everything, but to help them figure it out themselves. My mother had started taking her health seriously, sticking to her diet and keeping up with doctor's appointments. My father was adjusting to his diagnosis, even agreeing to let a financial advisor step in to help manage what little money they had left. It wasn't perfect, but it was functional. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't carrying it all alone. One Sunday afternoon, Michael came with me to my parents' house. He had been slowly becoming a bigger part of my life, never pushing, just being there, offering support in the quiet ways that mattered. My father greeted him with a firm handshake. So, you're the guy? Michael chuckled. Guess so. My mother watched them, then turned to me with a small smile. He's good for you. I raised an eyebrow. You never liked any of the guys I dated before. She shrugged. None of them stuck around when things got hard. Fair point. Michael glanced at me, amused. Should I be worried about an interrogation? I smirked. You'll survive. Later that night, as we drove back to my apartment, he glanced over at me. So, what now? I thought about it. About everything that had happened. About everything that still needed to happen. And for the first time, I wasn't overwhelmed by it. I don't know, I admitted. But whatever it is, I'm doing it on my terms. He smiled. Good answer. Months passed. My parents adjusted. My father's condition was stable. My mother had found a rhythm. And the house, while no longer the pristine showcase it once, was finally felt lived in, rather than just maintained. Olivia kept in touch, sending updates from rehab. She had gotten a part-time job, was working on paying back what she could, and most surprisingly wasn't trying to force her way back into the family. She was giving space, respecting boundaries. I still didn't fully trust her, but maybe, someday, I would. As for me, I thrived. Work was better than ever. My team respected me. My projects were exciting, and for the first time, I actually felt like I was building something for myself. And Michael? He stuck around. One evening, as we sat on my balcony, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, he reached for my hand. You ever think about what life would have been like if you never left that night? I exhaled. Yeah. And I squeezed his hand. I don't regret it. The old me would have. She would have wondered if she had done the right thing, if she had abandoned her family, if she should have stayed and suffered quietly. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I had saved myself. And that was enough.